Welcome to Gluck Radio. I am Dr. Errol Gluck, executive life coach and master problem solver. Today we're here with Rabbi David Meyer. We will be discussing the growing problem of anti-Semitism in Europe. There have been shootings at Jewish schools, vandalism, and verbal harassment. Above all, there's been anti-Jewish legislation. Even a neo-Nazi party was recently elected to the Greek parliament. This is sounding all too scary and all too familiar. Today is the most intimidating time for European Jews since the Holocaust, and thousands of Jews a year are fleeing to Israel. What is this new anti-Semitism like, and where did it come from? How immune is society from repeating awful history? What do we do to fight hatred that's this strong? Rabbi Meyer teaches at Gregorian Pontifical College in Rome. He's testified to Congress on European anti-Semitism, and he is currently living in Belgium. Rabbi Meyer, welcome. It's really a pleasure for me to have you. We're going to be touching a subject that not only is intellectually stimulating, it is not only emotionally personal for me, but it is something that if we don't actually pay attention to and address, we're looking at the potential for another Holocaust. It's not out of reason. So my first question that I want you to tell me is, you were exposed to anti-Semitism at a very young age. You saw a terror attack at a Paris synagogue. I want you to walk me through exactly what you saw and what happened afterwards.
Well, the first thing that I would like to say about that is that somehow I was involved at the synagogue when the terror attack took place in October 1980, and that was in the synagogue Copernic, which is in the center of Paris. And that was for me really the first experience of anti-Semitism, even though that was quite a massive and a dramatic one. But before that, and I was 13 at the time because it was just before my bar mitzvah, but before that, for the first 13 years of my life, certainly I had never been not only not exposed to anti-Semitism, but I sort of never heard about it. I was a student in a Paris school where there was absolutely no anti-Semitism whatsoever. There was no anti-Semitism in any sort of social milieu in which I was living. And so the waking up was really extremely brutal. What happened is that we were at the synagogue, my older brother and I, and we were doing our bar mitzvah together, and that was just a few weeks before the event. And towards the end of the service, there was an explosion that was outside of the synagogue. Apparently, the bomb was hidden in a motorcycle that was parked right by the entrance of the synagogue. And everybody obviously it shook absolutely the whole building, and everybody was shocked, and nobody quite understood for the first few seconds what happened, except that there was a sort of a glass ceiling over the synagogue, and a lot of the glasses had fell on the people who were standing in the middle. And I remember it's sort of a very strange feeling, but I remember that after the first few seconds, I thought, if that is a bomb attack, then surely there's going to be another one once we go out, which hopefully, of course, didn't happen. But that was my sort of first intuitive reaction, because I realized immediately that even though everybody was under shock in the synagogue, there was no victim in the synagogue as such. And I thought, well, if people want to do something like this, then surely they want more victims, and surely they will do it once everybody's coming out. So I had this sort of vision of another explosion that was going to take place, and which, as I said, of course, didn't happen. And then I guess it took probably a few seconds, or maybe a minute or two. It's really difficult to remember now. But we were then led out of the synagogue, and outside was the real carnage. I mean, there was a burning car. There were people who had been killed outside.
How many people were killed?
Well, actually, 4 people were killed, and one of the very disturbing facts, of course, is that among the people being killed, some of them were going into the synagogue. But there was one person that was just a passerby. And one of the incredible events about this bombing of the synagogue was the political declaration of the prime minister at the time, who was a man called Raymond Barre. Raymond Barre clearly had to intervene on the national TV and say how sorry he was for this event and how despicable the whole thing was. But then he added that out of the 4 victims, some were innocent and others were not. And of course, what he meant by that was that the victims who were the Jews going into the synagogue were not innocent victim, but the real innocent victim was just the passerby. And that really created an absolute outrage within the Jewish community of saying, well, how come France, which had given and was the first country to give citizenship to its citizen, at least in Europe, suddenly considered that Jewish victims are not really innocent because they were just happening to go into the synagogue, and the real innocents were just the passerby who were obviously non-Jews. And that really was a sort of a second wake-up call, the first one being the bomb as such, but the second one was the reaction of the political this prime minister who really didn't see us as equal citizens. And this, for me, was a really tremendous shock. And it's something that I have to say has never really left me, because since then, there's always been, and I think for a lot of French Jews as well, there's always been this sort of suspicion regarding the state and what really is our position as citizens of France, and who considers us as citizens and who is not quite sure, who has doubts, and who is just waiting to see what's going to happen. And that clearly sent back signal from the Second World War. Because the same situation happened. The Jews were French citizens, and then suddenly, from one day to the next, they were not citizens anymore.
I think for me, it even goes beyond that. I'll tell you my perspective, and I'm really curious to see your response to it. What I see is that it's not only that they're not citizens or they don't have the same legal status, but what I see in that statement is that the first step of the Holocaust, the first step of the type of hatred that it takes to wound, hurt, kill, humiliate, and destroy is when you devalue the person's value as a human being. So, meaning what I see the prime minister doing, what I see in all anti-Semitism is it's not, I don't like vanilla, I don't like chocolate. It's that Jews were made to, was projected upon Jews that they were less than human. Okay, they were less valuable as a human being. And I believe that is the scary part of the message of what's happening in Europe, is that it's not only about pointing fingers, as let's say you would have in this country, the Democrats versus the Republicans, but you would never, ever hear a Democrat or a Republican say that this person as a human being has a less valuable existence.
Yes, I mean, I think you're certainly partly right in pointing out the underlying message that was clearly spelled out in that message of the Prime Minister at the time. I think it would be somehow misleading to only believe that this was just a question of citizenship. I think the question is, what makes someone who is a politician, an educated man, in many ways someone who is considered by its peer to be a respectable individual, to suddenly come up with a statement like this one. And clearly what there is behind is this image that somehow, I don't know if Jews as human beings were seen by Raymond Barre as less than human, but certainly seen by him as somehow carrying with them a certain guilt, a certain responsibility, for which if from time to time they have to pay with their life, then this becomes perfectly legitimate. And this was the very scary vision somehow that I think many Jews at the time had, was to realize that very deeply rooted within the French establishment, there was the possibility of looking at Jews differently than anybody else, than any other individual within that community, or for that purpose within the wider world. And clearly that really sends a message of saying, well, if that is the case, then maybe it means that you're not exactly as humans as others could be.
Exactly.
Now, of course, that is possibly a very first step towards what happened during the Shoah, even though there's quite a gap, of course, between the Shoah as such and the declaration of Raymond Barre, and I don't think we should just jump that step.
Well, we're not going to jump
quickly.
that step, but what I want everyone to realize is that we think that we evolved to the point where that could never happen again, and yet it can. I want you to talk about what happened in the Jewish school of Toulouse.
Yes.
And what events happened, what led up to that?
Okay, well, what led up to that is clearly an intensification of the banalization of anti-Jewish speeches among all sorts of people in France, and not only in the Muslim community. The Toulouse shooting last March, so a year and a half ago, was, of course, carried out by a Muslim extremist.
So tell us exactly what happened. There was a shooting.
Well, there's this guy who came into the school. He had, first of all, killed, if I remember correctly, 2 Muslim French soldiers. So the first shooting he did was killing those soldiers, and then a few days later, he took a little motorcycle with a video camera and went in front of a Jewish school in Toulouse, came down at the time of, 8 o'clock in the morning when the kids were coming in, and he shot dead 4 people. 3 kids and a rabbi, also with one of his children. The rabbi was teaching in the school, filming everything. His idea was to post it on YouTube, and obviously being extremely proud of his doing. Maybe a little bit like what we've seen in London just 2 days ago. So basically, I mean, this is what happened. But this individual came out from within the radicalized Muslim community, but he came out in a context where French Jews had to endure a lot of years of difficult relationship with the Muslim community, but also with the wider French community, because seeing, as the quote of Raymond Barre was sort of explicitly stating, seeing that Jews were not always seen as citizens, and there are question marks about, what really is the value of their lives and so on and so forth, even though this is not a shared feeling by the majority of the French people, obviously. But nevertheless, this leaves some sort of marks within the society, and at some stage within that context, you do have violent, crazy, radicalized, fanatical individuals who come up and do acts such as the one in Toulouse, which was, again, an absolutely dreadful event. But what it does for the Jewish community is it's sending a signal where you are questioning whether or not you can really safely live in this country. And I give you another example of that because people don't talk about this too much. But a few months after the Toulouse shooting, there was, within the police forces, there were calls by some of the unions of the police forces to say that they don't want to protect Jewish sites because it's too dangerous. And the question is, well, if I'm a citizen and if I'm an equal citizen, what does that mean?
Exactly. Did the government, by the way, in this shooting, or did the government in responding or not responding to the police saying that they don't want to protect the Jewish community because it's too dangerous, what was the backlash against them, if any? Did the government step in and say, punish the person who said that? What was the government's response?
I think what happened was very simple. This was coming from one of the union of the policemen. It always comes under cover of some legal reasons behind, and it's never as clear-cut and said in such a bold way. But obviously the call was totally ignored, and clearly the French government always steps in and try at least its best to protect the Jewish institution. So that particular story didn't go anywhere. But the only question that it raises is how come someone dares to even raise the question? And it's not, of course, the risk for us, I think, French Jews, is not to suddenly see the government saying, well, maybe we shouldn't protect the Jewish citizen. I mean, I don't think that's the issue at all. I think the issue is just how come some people within the police forces or within the government or within whatever level of the society even have the ability to ask such a question. It's the question that's disturbing. And so far we are very clear about the answer, and the government, from whatever party, whether it was the right or the left, have always been extremely clear as to the policy it has with regard to the Jewish population, who is entirely French, and there's never been any question at that level. But the fact that the question exists is in itself quite troubling, I think.
Let's go past that. According to you, Rabbi, there are two forms of anti-Semitism. One is on a street level violence, vandalism, but then there's a institutional and legislative anti-Semitism. I want you to tell our listeners about the legislative anti-Semitism.
Okay, what's happening, and I will talk at a sort of a European level here, because of course it varies greatly from one country to the other. But at a European level, what we've seen so far is two movements. The first one is a movement that wants to outlaw Jewish slaughtering for kosher purposes, on the ground that the shchita and the way, the Jewish way of slaughtering the animal doesn't quite fit with the ethical standard of Europe, which in itself is a very, very disturbing argument, in particular when we look at the history of Europe. And I'm not just talking about what happened during the Holocaust, but I'm also talking about what happened during the recent years in Bosnia and others. So when people talk about the ethical standard of Europe, and then saying that the main and the most important fight is to fight against kosher slaughtering, while at the same time the genocide in Bosnia, nobody in Europe said anything, it somehow sends a very strange message of saying, well, why are you suddenly picking up on the Jewish community, and for that purpose on the Muslim community as well, though?
We need to also make it clear to our audience that, from my understanding, and Rabbi, you obviously are the expert, that the kosher slaughtering among animals, part of what needs to take place is that there cannot be suffering within the animal, so that the slaughtering process does not allow the animal to suffer. Am I correct in that?
Yes, that's right. I mean, the technical argument is that in the kosher slaughtering, you're trying to make the animal suffer as little as possible. And the way you do that is by cutting the throat in a particular way, and so on and so forth. The argument against kosher slaughtering is to say, yes, but when you do that, the animal is still conscious of what's happening. And so therefore you have to, first of all, render the animal unconscious before you can start the kosher slaughtering, which is, in a way, a little bit of a technical argument. And if the argument was purely technical, I think some sort of understanding would come up, because Judaism also has an ability sometimes to amend slightly its own rules in order to fit the context of the time. But the reason I think why it is not going that way is precisely because the Jewish community is asking itself of saying, how come suddenly Europe is talking about being in such an ethical elevated place that they are so disturbed by kosher slaughtering, when at the same time, when there was a genocide in Rwanda, Europe didn't do anything. When there was a genocide in Bosnia, Europe didn't do anything. So it looks like this sort of a double standard, which becomes totally ridiculous, and that makes the Jewish community feel that they're picking on us again. So the first legislation that's happening in a few European countries is that we can't have kosher meat anymore, and the only way to do it is by importing it from such and such other country where it's still permitted. So that's, of course, the beauty of the European Union, is what's forbidden here is permitted there, and as long as you can manage to get whatever you want, it works fine so far. The other piece of legislation,
Sorry, I was going to say, what's interesting is this actually also must affect Muslims. And did this legislation cause the rabbis and the imams to actually unite and get together?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, you have plenty of cases in the UK, in France, in Belgium, where on the very specific issues, such as the kosher slaughtering and the ritual slaughtering, to include the Muslim community as well, rabbis and imams, Jewish community, Muslim communities work together in order to try and circumvent the legal projects or the laws when they're voted, and that has been usually quite efficient. But it hasn't worked in every country. So we still have countries where it's not permitted, and the problem is that those countries are becoming more numerous as we speak. I mean, I don't have the list of countries with me, but I know that regularly you read in the press that now in that country you can't have kosher meat anymore, and so you have to import it from somewhere else. But it does lead, and that's one of the positive elements from time to time, is that in front of adversity. But again, it is a symptom of adversity. In front of adversity, there is a sort of a getting together of the Jewish and the Muslim community. And that's an interesting outcome, if you want, of that situation. But I think personally, much more worrying than the kosher meat is the question of the circumcision, which came about from Germany to start with, of all places, and there was, I think, last June, where there was this recommendation by a local court to ban circumcision on the ground of human rights, and on the ground that this was contrary to the European Charter of Human Rights, because, so the judges said, this is inflicting on the child without the consent of the child and for no medical reason bodily harm that is irreversible. And so they banned circumcision. So now that made an uproar in Germany to start with, but also in the rest of Europe. But what was really worrying is that in the footstep of that judgment of a local court in Germany, Austria did the same, Switzerland did the same, I think some Scandinavian countries did the same.
As we stand right now, Rabbi, which countries actually ban circumcision?
Well, so far, the German ruling was quashed by a federal court in Germany. So the case in Germany has been cleared. So far, what is left is, I think there is a period where circumcision is not permitted for the time being until they decide in Austria and in Switzerland, as far as I know. But the problem behind this is that it seems to me that the problem will come back at any opportunity, because the only reason the judgment of the German court was quashed was for political reasons, because the Angela Merkel understood extremely well that out of Germany something like this cannot come out. And she put all the political pressure to quash the judgment. And this is what happened. She did it very well, and she was successful. But the end result of that is that, once again, the Jews have not been treated like through the normal way. It's because of political pressure, so it comes back as a boomerang against us. And I have absolutely no doubt that the problem of circumcision is going to come back in force in many, many European countries. Because when you speak to people, whether it's people on the street, whether it's people in university, whether it's intellectual journalists, and you name it, everybody, a lot of, maybe not everybody, but many, many people do believe that there is a problem with circumcision. And they equate circumcision with excision. And they say, well, if you want to live in Europe, then you have to follow the European rules. The real difficulty, of course, with this is that there is a conflict of interest between circumcision and the European Charter of Human Rights. And so that's why they have a basis and a real legal basis to declare that circumcision could become illegal in European countries. So there is here a real issue that we're going to have to tackle within the Jewish community if we want to stay in Europe.
Right. Now, but my concern and my question is that what it appears to me is that Europe is simply saying, we don't want Jews here, and we're going to come up with legislation under the guise of this is about human rights, when they have never lifted a finger against real human rights, real massacres, slaughters around the world. From my understanding, that public opinion is turning against Jews in Europe. I have a statistic here that says 44% of Europeans think Jews have control over the international finances, and 51% think that Jews are more loyal to Israel than their own country. Now, two questions. One is, do you feel that Europe is simply trying to find ways to get rid of their Jews? And as this is happening, what's the backlash? Is there a backlash among the population that is creating more anger towards more anger towards the Jews?
Well, I would say it's maybe possibly a little bit more subtle than that, because I don't think that the majority of Europeans, non-Jews European, would obviously not openly say, but even openly believe that they want to get rid of Jews. I don't think that's the issue. I don't think they want to get rid of Jews. I think what they don't understand, and this is where it might be a no-return sort of situation, is that there are so few Jews in Europe that people start to imagine all sorts of things, because the Jew becomes an imaginary figure. When you discuss with people who are against circumcision on human rights grounds, and you ask them and you say, who among you has ever been to a circumcision? Nobody has ever been. You say, who has ever spoken to a Jew? Who knows a Jew? They don't. We are so few here, in fact, that it ends up becoming an imaginary situation of, oh, well, the Jews do that, or the Jews speak like this, or the Jews have such and such a ritual. But in fact, Jewish rituals, unlike in the States, are not part of the popular culture. And for me, that is the key problem. It's not so much that they want to get rid of Jews as such because they know Jews and they don't like what Jews do. They just have this imaginary figure because they've never really met them. And we are so few that we actually can't even blame them for that, because we're just very, very few in numbers. I mean,
I guess I disagree for this reason, and
yeah.
I disagree because if you are Jewish, you will circumcise your sons, and the process of circumcision. And again, you could tell me if I'm wrong. When the mohel is circumcising the child, we're talking about seconds of pain. We're also talking about a procedure that prevents certain types of cancer. And from a medical point of view, you have a lot of non-Jews in this country and in other countries that choose circumcision because it's cleaner and there's less infection and there's less chances of cancer.
But you see, what you're saying is a very good illustration of the fact that within the States, everybody knows what you've just said about circumcision, right? People know more or less that circumcision, as you said, it's a half a second of pain. It's absolutely, there's no danger to it because of the way it's done, because the mohalim are trained, and so on and so forth. But if you ask the same question in Europe and you say to people, can you please tell me what the circumcision is like, or how long does it take? They have no idea. I mean, if you tell them it takes half an hour of slowly cutting off whatever you need to cut off, they look at you and they say, oh, well, that's okay. That's probably what I thought about half an hour. They just don't know. And the fact that
don't they have the internet? Meaning when people look at circumcision, don't they go to the internet? They go to the internet for everything else. Everyone in Europe has a cell phone. Everyone can simply text circumcision. So is it ignorance or is it purposeful ignorance? It's
a very good question. I appreciate your question. I think I have to agree that certainly there is a very strong level of purposeful ignorance on this particular issue. And it's also because this purposeful ignorance is also because on a daily life, they don't really know any Jews. And you ask them of saying, why don't you go and look about circumcision on the internet? They say, well, there's all sorts of rituals in China that I've never been looking at because I just don't know them and it's not relevant to my life. And when you're very few in numbers, this is what it does. I mean, just think of it. I'm speaking to you from Brussels. There's 5,000 Jews here. That's all. The city is about 1 million.
I'm speaking to you from New York City, where there are as many Jews as there are non-Jews, and yet we have anti-Semitism here. But my question is, and this is my point. My point is that people are generally unhappy about some part of their life, and they could either do something about it, which is make their life better, or they could blame and look for an enemy to hate. And Jews have been that political enemy to hate. This question about controlling the international finances, when in fact the international finances the Jews were made to take control, because both in Christianity and in Islam interest was not permitted to be collected in terms of loans, and Jews were made to take that role.
Yes, and you're right. I mean, this is still, of course, very relevant today. It's the scapegoat theory, where on many instances where people have a problem and they can't deal with it, they're just finding a scapegoat. And that traditionally, historically, has been the role regarding anti-Semitism, and in Europe in particular, where it was very convenient to go and look for the Jew, in particular in the finance situation where the Jews were put. And this might be a reflex by a lot of people still today. So that, of course, is part of the explanation as to, why suddenly picking up on the Jews again, even though it's done through different means, which are more legal procedures and so on and so forth. It's a little bit more undercover. It's not as blunt and as direct as an immediate attack against Jews in Europe as such. But the result, though, might be exactly the same. So we are in Europe. We have an inheritance, if you want, of those practice of this reality of the Jew being the scapegoat, and that is not absent from what is happening in Europe today. So we do have to face that problem as well. And I think clearly what we're seeing in regarding anti-Semitism in Europe is that it's a multifaceted issue. Part of it is the importation of the conflict in the Middle East. Part of it is under the disguise of legislation against Jews because of human rights issues, and part of it is a traditional scapegoat problem, and part of it is still deeply rooted within the European society. I mean, I can give you an example which I had some years ago, where I was invited to speak at the French Senate at the one of the military commission of the French Senate, and I was supposed to talk on the impact of the Middle East in European societies. I introduced myself, saying I was a rabbi living in Brussels, married to a Canadian with a dual French and Israeli citizenship, but I had lived in England and in Belgium and so on and so forth. And the people who were sitting in the room just stopped me. They didn't let me talk. And they said, well, then go back to your country. I have nothing to say here. I said, what do you mean? He said, well, you just told us that you're living everywhere and that you have a dual citizenship. What are you thinking you have something to say at that commission of the French Senate? So this is a very deeply rooted tradition of, as you were mentioning earlier, Jews are more loyal to the state of Israel than they could be to France, even though they're French citizens and so on and so forth. I mean, you find all of those elements within the current reality of European anti-Semitism, sadly.
Yeah, I want to throw out some statistics so that our audience gets a sense of what we're really talking about. In the entire world, there are only 13.7 million Jews in the entire world. We have 1.57 billion Muslims. In Europe, there are 10 Muslims for every one Jew. Out of the Nobel Prize laureates, 177 out of 850 were actually Jewish. Why, for people so small who have created such amazing solutions to benefit the quality of life for people all over the world, why is this type of hatred that created the Holocaust and that created the history of Judaism is the history of a people trying to exist from extermination? Why, in your opinion, is this still going on?
Well, you're asking a very difficult question. I think part of the reason where all this happened against the Jewish people certainly has been carried through religious teaching in Europe, religious teaching of the church, where for many years was a teaching of disrespectful, to say the least, teaching regarding Judaism, which somehow has been extremely deeply ingrained and rooted into a European Christian mentality. What we're facing today, I think, is we are realizing that after the Shoah, how deeply rooted those teachings have been and how long it will take if one wants to remain positive, and I'm not sure about that, but if one wants to remain optimistic about the future, we then have to accept how deeply rooted and how long it's going to take to uproot that those sort of teaching. So this is a sort of a social, if you want, reality of what's happening in Europe as a result of century of anti-Semitism.
Again, my concern is that during the Second World War, the Jews, their attitude was, this will pass, let's lay low. I don't think any of this is passing. I think that this needs to be addressed head on, and that now it needs to be a real public discussion out in the open. I mean, tell us what's happening in Hungary. Tell us what's happening in Greece in terms of what legislation. From my understanding, Hungary political party, the Jobbik, is blacklisting Jews as security risks.
Yes, no, absolutely. I mean, what's happening, so far, we've spoken about Western Europe. That's where most of my experience is. But clearly, if you go and you look at Hungary or you look at Greece, the situation is totally drastic. Here in Hungary and Greece, we're not talking about subtle anti-Semitism. We're not talking about little legislation here and there against slaughtering and circumcision. We're talking about political entities sitting in their parliament and openly having a purely racial anti-Semitic argument, and everybody accepts it. And what is absolutely dramatic is that those countries are part of the European Union, and apparently there's nothing the European Union is doing. And that, again, is extremely revealing, because in the idea, certainly, of the construction of Europe after the Second World War, the idea that this will never happen again was a very strong element in the commitment for the building of Europe. And what we see today is that even in those countries where anti-Semitism is open, virulent, daily, violent in physical act, nobody says and nobody moves an eyelash at the European Commission about this, and there's no question of expelling Greece, for example, from Europe because of what the way part of their political parties treat the Jews, or expelling Hungary, of saying, you have absolutely nothing to do there, because if that's how you treat the Jews, then you can't be part of Europe. And here, there's something which for me is extremely, again, very disturbing, of saying, how come Europe cannot react at a political level? Everybody seems to be ready to discuss whether, because of the financial crisis, the Greece should be part of Europe, but because of anti-Semitism, nobody is ready to tackle that head on. And I think there is a point, and that you're right, and I think in the States, you are much more accustomed to deal with issues head-on. But there is a point where, in front of such radical form of anti-Semitism, where Jews are blacklisted and so on and so forth officially, Europe is very oddly, totally silent, as if there's nothing they can do and as if there's nothing they can say. And that is partly because the subject of talking about Judaism in Europe, because of what happened during the Shoah, is such a difficult subject that nobody talks about it. And it sort of all goes under the carpet as if the problem is going to disappear. And I would agree with you that this, for me, is a very, very serious mistake, and it's a strategic mistake.
Right, because we cannot let anything going under the carpet. Never again means never again. We're not talking about benign issues. Greece has a neo-Nazi party called the Golden Dawn.
That's right.
Correct? Okay. Denmark, that was famous for their resistance towards Nazi Germany, not turning over their Jews. They now, from my understanding, are beginning to move in a way that appears to be anti-Semitic. What do you know about what's going on in Denmark?
I don't know much about what's going on in Denmark. I know more about what's going on in Sweden, which...
All right, talk about Sweden.
Currently almost the most recurrent form of attacks against Jews, particularly coming this time really from the Muslim community, and that seems to be quite particular to Sweden, even though this is also a reality in the UK and in France and in Belgium and so on and so forth, but it's not as obvious as it is in Sweden. What's happening in Malmö, for example, where there are anti-Jewish march on the streets, and this is something that I wouldn't say happen daily, but certainly happen on a regular basis, and is something that seems to be, again, tolerated by the local population. A lot of it, of course, is done under the cover of the problem in the Middle East and the relationship between Israel and the Palestinians and so on and so forth. But the end result is that Jews can hardly live there. And you can always talk to people, and they can always tell you that they're not anti-Semitic, they're anti-Zionist, or they don't like this, or it's because of the state of Israel. The end result is that when Jews cannot live there any longer, then the end result is that that country has gotten rid of its Jews. And that is what I said to people. I said, stop telling me about the fact that you're not anti-Semitic, that you're not this, that you're not that, and it's only because of the policies in the territories or because of the settlers or this and that. I said the end result is that when Jews will not be able to live in Belgium anymore, Belgium would have gotten rid of its Jews a way or another. You call it the way you want, but this will end up being a place where Jews can't live. And if that is not anti-Semitism, then I don't know what anti-Semitism is. And so there is a point where I think in order not to get trapped into a semantic argument with those sort of people, there is a way of tackling it head on regarding the consequence. And the consequence is that there's a lot of Jews in Europe today who are very, very seriously considering their choices for their future. We're not afraid as such on the daily life, but we are certainly worried as to what is the best place or a decent place where my kids can grow up safely. And
Rabbi, I'm going to say this. I'm going to say you're not worried about what's happening on a daily basis.
Yes, I agree. Yeah, absolutely.
But if things are going in the way in which they're going, if there's not going to be a united voice to speak out about this, every single country, with very few exceptions, when there's any vote in the UN about Israel, there is almost Israel has no allies except for the United States and at times England, which has its own anti-Semitism problem. Canada also often does get the Jewish vote. But let me change the subject just for a quick second. In your work, you allude to Jewish values. What are Jewish values, and how do you see them differ from the accepted ethical values in agnosticism or atheist doctrine?
I think for me, when I use the term Jewish values, I try to refer to teaching from the Talmudic and the rabbinic tradition, which over the centuries have created a set of values, moral behavior that at times are very similar or totally identical to what we see in a more secular society in the States or here in Europe, but at times do differ a little bit. And I just give you an example. One particular example. The question about circumcision, I think, helped me to understand that there was a value and a difference of perception of value between what the European Charter seems to represent and what the Jewish commandments seem to represent, which is quite different. The basis of the European Charter is that everybody can choose everything that is right for him or her. In Judaism, of course, there is a question of non-choice. Usually I'm born Jewish, except for people who convert, but normally someone is born Jewish, and when the circumcision takes place, it's not a question of choice. The child is circumcised. Here there's a difference of value, because what you're actually saying when you're practicing, if we stay on the topic of circumcision, is that when you're practicing circumcision, you're actually putting in the front value the fact that some stuff in life are not dependent on my choice. And that doesn't mean that they're bad. It doesn't mean that they're...
No, I completely agree with you, but here's, I think, where I'm getting to. I'm getting to that the reason why it is easy to hate someone is because you don't know exactly why you're hating them, with the exception of that you have so much anger and you're looking for a scapegoat that's easy. Okay, the Jews were easy to be scapegoats because they, in fact, did not fight back. I think that we as Jews need to let the world know what we stand for, what are our values, what is the real problem that you have with our existence. Israel has had, whether they deny it or don't deny it, they've had nuclear weapons since the late 70s. Some say as many as 80. They could have very well have leveled the playing field, in many wars that occurred after the 70s, but they never chose to. Okay? If any of the Arab countries had functional nuclear weapons during those wars, Israel would cease to exist. Okay. So what my concern is that, one, what's happening in Europe is too familiar of what has happened prior to the Holocaust. What is happening in Europe is happening, I feel, also to some degree in this country. But it's much more quiet. I think that Jews need to speak up and say who they are, what are their values, and what do they really bring to the table, so that everything's out and open. If you're going to hate someone, you better well know why you're hating them.
I understand your point. I think one of the issues that is linked to that is that, of course, the self-image that we as Jews have of ourselves today is very different from the image that others have of us. People do continue to talk about the Jew as an image of someone who is vulnerable, someone who is on the suffering side and who is showing compassion and ethics. The current reality, because of the Shoah and because of the State of Israel, is that even though we, of course, don't give up on ethics, and of course we don't give up on our concern for those who are vulnerable, is also that we're ready to fight. And this is what the State of Israel has brought. And that reality is extremely disturbing for a lot of people, of saying, well, that is not the image of the Jew that I carry. I was happy with my old image of the Jew, and then suddenly I'm confronted to an image that is fairly different. And I think this is a reality that many in the Jewish community are trying to make as clear as possible, of saying, I don't know with what image of the Jews you're working with, but the one you have in your mind is not the image of the Jews in the 21st century. The image of the Jews of the 21st century is the Jew who's ready to fight back and who has the means to do so. Will not be happy to do it, but has the means to do it.
You know what? And thank God for that image, because Israel is not saying I'm ready to fight. They're saying I am ready to defend. Okay, and if they were ready to fight, there would be no Arab countries, but they're ready to defend, and that's what they do. Rabbi, I could go on for hours with you because you're so fascinating, and your writings are so important. But unfortunately, time does not permit that. I wanted, from the bottom of my heart, thank you for your voice, for what you're doing, and for what you are bringing to light.
Well, thank you very much for this interview.
Oh, keep up the great work, and
will do.
I look forward to another meeting with you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
I truly like to thank Rabbi David Meyer once again for joining me on the show. There is so much more to talk about and so much more investigation to be done. If you'd like to learn more about his work, you could watch videos on his congressional testimony online by searching, in quotes, anti-Semitism, a growing threat to all faiths. I am Dr. Errol Gluck. Remember, to every problem there is a solution. Please check out our episodes on gluckradio.com. There is something for everyone. Tell all your friends. There's not a single person you know that won't take a specific interest in what we have on our podcasts. You could go to wabcradio.com. Don't forget to like us on Facebook. And for those of you who want to sponsor a show or might even like to be on a show, call our office at 212-599-3195. Till next time.